The night it happened was the coldest one of that winter. I remember because the windows trembled from the wind, and the silence inside the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My husband was already asleep in the next room, his slow, steady breathing just audible through the thin wall that separated us. It was strange how a sound that once comforted me now felt like distance itself. The clock on the dresser glowed 2:17 a.m. I was lying awake again, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks that had become as familiar to me as the lines on my own hands. The air smelled faintly of rain, and I could hear it tapping on the roof, small, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting something down. That's when I heard the creak. It came from the hallway. Soft, cautious, almost human. For a moment I froze. Then came another, a heavier sound, followed by the faintest huff of breath. My heart jumped. I sat up, clutching the blanket around me, staring toward the half-open door. And then he appeared. A shadow first, large and uncertain, framed by the dim light spilling from the hall. Then the shape moved closer, slow but purposeful, until the outline of a dog filled the doorway. "Benji?" I whispered. He stepped inside, tail low, eyes reflecting a faint glimmer from the street lamp outside. The rain had soaked his fur. Little droplets clung to him, catching the light as he moved. He stopped just inside the room, head tilted, waiting. I don't know why, but I felt tears sting my eyes. Maybe it was the simple fact that someone, had chosen to come toward me. "Come here," I murmured. My voice cracked. He hesitated, then padded forward, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. When he reached the side of the bed, he looked up at me. Those brown eyes deep and searching, full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. I lifted the blanket. "Okay," I whispered. "Just for a while." He climbed up slowly, careful, circling once before lying down beside me. His fur was cold and damp, but the weight of him pressed against me like an anchor. Within moments, the rhythm of his breathing filled the room, syncing with mine. For the first time in months, I slept. When I woke, the world was painted in pale morning light. Benji was still there, curled at the foot of the bed, chest rising and falling. I could hear the faint hum of my husband's alarm in the next room, the shuffle of his feet against the floorboards. He didn't come in. He never did anymore. I reached down and ran my fingers through Benji's fur. It was softer than it looked, still slightly damp near his neck. He lifted his head and looked at me with that same calm, wordless curiosity that dogs have, the kind that doesn't demand anything, doesn't judge. "Morning," I said quietly. His tail thumped once against the blanket. In that simple sound, that small, loyal response, I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the quiet. Benji had been my husband's idea. We'd adopted him 3 years earlier, when the house still felt too large, too empty. "A dog will fill the space," my husband had said, though now I realize he meant the physical space, not the silence between us. Back then, I believed a living thing could heal what was breaking. I thought maybe we could teach ourselves to care again by caring for something together. But like most of our plans, that one unraveled quietly. My husband worked late. Business trips, deadlines, missed dinners. When he was home, he moved through the house like a ghost. Polite, predictable, unreachable. And I stopped trying to reach him. Somewhere along the line, my words had started echoing back at me like they were bouncing off glass. But Benji stayed. He was there when I came home to an empty house, when I sat in the kitchen with cold tea and thoughts I didn't want to face. He'd sit at my feet, head resting on my knee, breathing steady and patient, like he knew that silence was sometimes the only language I had left. That morning, my husband appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work. His tie was slightly crooked, his hair damp from the shower. "You left your light on again," he said. "I know," I murmured. His eyes flicked toward the bed, where Benji was now sitting upright, tail wagging once. "You let him in. He was scared of the storm." My husband frowned. "You know he's not supposed to be in here." "He wasn't hurting anything." He sighed, glancing at his watch. Whatever. Just keep him off the bed next time. Then he turned and left. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt final. Benji looked up at me, head tilted as if he too was waiting for something else to happen. "It's okay," I said softly. "He doesn't mean it." But I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. Days passed, slow and heavy. The rain stopped, but the chill lingered. I spent most mornings sitting by the window, sketching the bare trees outside while Benji dozed at my feet. He had a way of filling space without taking it. Just being there, quiet and steady. Sometimes I'd talk to him. Small things at first. What to cook for dinner, what color to paint the living room. But gradually the words grew heavier. I told him about the emptiness. About the way my husband's eyes had changed. How they used to look at me and now seemed to look through me. About how I'd started counting the hours by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing. Benji would listen, his head resting on his paws, his gaze never leaving mine. It's strange how honesty feels easier in the presence of something that can't reply. One night, a week after the storm, I woke again to the sound of rain, lighter this time, almost gentle. My husband had fallen asleep watching television. The blue glow from the living room spilled faintly under the door. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the shadows moving across the ceiling. Then came the sound, soft paws against the floorboards. Benji pushed open the door with his nose and stepped into the room. He hesitated, looking toward the hallway as if checking whether he was allowed. "It's okay," I whispered. He came closer, slow and sure, then climbed up beside me again. His fur brushed against my arm, warm now, dry. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through the blanket. The house was silent except for that, and the faint hum of the rain outside. Somewhere deep inside, something began to thaw. I don't know when it happened exactly, the moment I began to need him more than I should have. It wasn't dramatic. There was no breaking point, no sudden realization. Just small things that built quietly, like the tide rising while you're not watching. The mornings when I'd wake before dawn, just to see him waiting by the door. The way he'd follow me from room to room. His presence grounding me when everything else felt uncertain. The way he'd lean his head against my leg when I felt like fading out of myself. Love, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits beside you, until you notice it's there. My husband started noticing the distance too, though he mistook it for defiance. "You spend more time with that dog than with me," he said one night, half laughing but not really joking. "He's easier to talk to," I replied before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air like a slap. He stared at me, expression unreadable, then shook his head and turned away. I didn't apologize. I couldn't, because it was true. Winter deepened. Frost laced the edges of the windows each morning, and the garden outside turned to pale, sleeping shapes. I began painting again. Small canvases at first, then larger ones. Scenes of light and shadow. Rain-slick roads, quiet fields. The outline of a dog against the horizon. Benji would sit beside me for hours, watching. When I painted him, he'd tilt his head, curious, as if wondering why I found him worth capturing. "Because you're the only thing that still feels real," I told him once. Laughing softly, his tail wagged once in answer. The night of the second storm, the wind came harder than before. The lights flickered, then went out completely. I lit candles, their small flames trembling in the dark. My husband was away on another business trip. The house felt bigger without him, emptier, but somehow easier to breathe in. Benji was restless, pacing near the door, whining softly. "It's okay," I said, kneeling beside him. "I'm scared too." He pressed his forehead against mine. His fur smelled faintly of rain and earth. I wrapped my arms around him and felt the tension ease from both of us. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. But inside, for once, I wasn't afraid, because I wasn't alone. When the power returned hours later, the candles had burned low, wax pooling across the table like melted time. Benji lay at my feet, asleep, his body rising and falling in perfect rhythm. I sat there, staring at the flicker of light returning to the walls, and thought about how strange life is. How the things that save you rarely look like salvation at first. Sometimes they just walk into your room when the world is too quiet. In the morning, my husband called from the airport. "Storm bad?" he asked. "Not too bad," I said. "You okay?" "I'm fine." There was a pause. "You sound different." "Maybe I am." Another pause. "I'll be home tomorrow." "Okay." When the call ended, I stood by the window, watching the sky turn from gray to gold. Benji came to sit beside me, his reflection overlapping mine in the glass. And for a fleeting moment, I saw what we must look like from the outside. A woman and a dog standing in the morning light, both a little weathered, both still standing. That evening, I found an old photograph tucked behind a drawer, one from our wedding day. We were both smiling then, the kind of smile that comes from believing love will fix everything. I stared at it for a long time, before placing it back where I'd found it. Some memories are better left where they lie. The next night, my husband came home late. I heard the door creak, his suitcase rolling across the floor, the soft clink of keys on the counter. I stayed in bed, pretending to sleep. Benji lifted his head, ears twitching, but didn't move. My husband peeked into the room for a moment, then quietly shut the door. And just like that, the wall between us grew another inch thicker. I turned toward Benji and whispered, "You're all I have left that listens." His eyes blinked slowly, knowingly, before he rested his head back on the blanket. In the weeks that followed, life settled into its quiet rhythm again. My husband drifted through the days like a ghost, his world full of meetings and numbers and schedules. Mine became a collection of moments spent in stillness. Morning walks through frost-coated fields, evenings by the fireplace, the steady company of a creature who asked for nothing except presence. And though I knew it couldn't last forever, that the fragile peace we'd built might one day shatter, I held on to it anyway, because sometimes even borrowed light is enough to see you through the dark. One night, near the end of February, I woke to find Benji gone. The door was open, the curtain by the window stirring gently. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my coat and ran outside, barefoot, calling his name into the frozen air. Snow crunched beneath my feet, the cold biting at my skin. The moon was full, silvering the yard in light so bright it looked like dawn. Then I saw him, standing by the fence, motionless, staring toward the woods beyond. When I reached him, he didn't move. His body trembled slightly, his breath visible in small white clouds. I knelt beside him, following his gaze. Across the field, something flickered, maybe light, maybe shadow. Then nothing. I touched his collar gently. "Come on," I whispered. "Let's go home." He hesitated, then turned, pressing against my leg as we walked back toward the house. Inside, the warmth hit us both like a wave. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart racing. Benji circled once, then lay down at my feet, eyes half closed. I sank to the floor beside him, running my fingers through his fur until the shaking stopped. And for the first time in my life, I realized what safety truly felt like. It wasn't walls or locks or promises whispered at altars. It was breath against skin. It was warmth shared in silence. It was knowing that, even in the darkest room, something good had found its way to you, and stayed. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, reality was enough. And as the wind whispered outside and the house settled into sleep, I lay there beside him, a woman, a heartbeat, a shadow in the quiet. And I knew that whatever came next, I wasn't alone anymore. The morning after felt like waking into someone else's life. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for the steady sound of Benji's breathing at the foot of the bed. Sunlight crept across the floorboards, slow and deliberate, like it was hesitant to disturb the silence that had settled overnight. For a moment, I just lay there watching the light move, listening to the faint rhythm of his breath. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. My body felt heavy, but not tired, just full somehow. like every nerve had been turned up a little higher. When I finally got up, Benji followed, stretching first, then padding after me down the hall. His nails clicked softly against the floor, an echo that filled the emptiness between each heartbeat. My husband's door was still closed. I stood there for a second, staring at it, waiting to hear movement, the sound of water running, or the scrape of a chair, but nothing came. The silence behind that door had a weight to it now, one I'd grown used to carrying. "Come on," I whispered to Benji. "Let's get breakfast." The kitchen smelled like cold coffee and yesterday's toast. I turned on the kettle and stood by the window, watching mist drift over the field behind the house. The world outside was pale and soft, everything blurred at the edges. Benji sat beside me, watching too. His reflection ghosted in the glass. Warm brown eyes, quiet focus, waiting. "Do you ever wonder what you're waiting for?" I asked, half smiling. He blinked slowly, the way he always did when he didn't understand but wanted me to know he was listening. The kettle began to whistle, sharp and sudden. I turned off the stove and poured the water, the steam rising between us. I thought about how strange it was that you could share a life with someone, share years, a house, a history, and still feel more seen by a creature who couldn't speak. When my husband finally emerged, it was almost noon. He walked in wearing that same look he always wore after a trip, distracted, distant, already halfway gone again. "Morning," he said flatly, reaching for a mug. "Afternoon," I corrected gently. He gave a small smile, the polite kind, and took a sip of coffee. Benji watched him from the corner of the room, tail still. My husband's eyes flicked toward him briefly before returning to the newspaper. "You really should train him to stay out of the bedroom," he said after a moment. "It's not good for him to think he's on the same level." The words stung more than they should have. On the same level as what? As us. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Maybe he already knows his place better than we do. He looked up, brow furrowed, but said nothing. Just folded the newspaper and left the room. Benji's tail brushed softly against my leg. I let out a shaky breath. "It's okay," I murmured. "He doesn't mean it." But the truth was, I wasn't sure he meant anything anymore. That night, my husband slept in his office again. He'd been doing that more lately. Long hours, late calls, the glow of his laptop spilling through the crack under the door. I didn't ask questions. I'd learned that questions didn't build bridges anymore. They just reminded us of the gap between us. So I stayed in our room, painting. The half-finished canvas on the easel had become a portrait of Benji without me realizing it. Just his eyes, deep and dark and endless. He lay near my feet, his steady breathing grounding me as the brush moved. Outside, wind rattled the branches against the windows. I thought about all the storms that had passed since he first came into my life, and how somehow each one had left me standing, even when I didn't want to be. When the clock struck midnight, I set the brush down and whispered, "You should be asleep." He lifted his head, eyes half-lidded, and let out a quiet sigh. "I know," I said. "Me too." In the morning, the house smelled faintly of my husband's cologne. Sharp, expensive, fading. I found a note on the counter. Business trip. Back Thursday, no explanation, no warmth. Just dates and absence. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with all the others. A small, neat collection of excuses. Benji nudged my leg. I knelt, pressed my forehead to his, and whispered, "It's just you and me again." His tail wagged once, slow and sure, as if to say, it always was. Those days blurred together. The weather turned soft, the kind of early spring that teases warmth, but doesn't quite deliver it. I spent my mornings walking the fields with Benji, the wind brushing through his fur, the world still quiet enough to hear my own thoughts. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring at something I couldn't see, a rustle in the grass, a sound carried by the breeze. His body would tense, ears forward, as if remembering a world before this one. "Do you miss it?" I'd ask. Before us? He'd look back at me, eyes calm, steady. Whatever answer he gave, it was wordless. But I always understood. The third day my husband was gone, I found one of his old shirts hanging on the back of a chair. It smelled faintly of him. Not the version that lived here now, but the one from before. The one who used to laugh, who used to fill the room just by being in it. I sat on the edge of the bed holding it, feeling that ache crawl up my chest, the one that never really leaves. Benji jumped onto the bed beside me, curling into the empty space that had once belonged to someone else. I laid the shirt across my lap, and he rested his head on it. And for some reason, that small act undid me. Tears came before I could stop them. Silent at first, then shaking, unstoppable. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stayed there, still and solid, his warmth against my skin like a promise I hadn't known I needed. I buried my face in his fur and whispered, "I don't even know what's wrong with me anymore." But I did. It was everything. The next morning, I woke to sunlight on my face and the weight of Benji's head resting on my arm. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Then came the guilt. It wasn't the kind of guilt that comes from doing something wrong. It was the kind that comes from realizing you've built your peace somewhere it doesn't belong. He wasn't mine to depend on. He wasn't meant to carry what I couldn't say aloud, and yet he did. Every day. When my husband returned, he brought the smell of airports and fatigue with him. His suitcase thudded against the floor, and Benji barked once, sharp but uncertain. "Quiet," my husband snapped automatically. "He's just saying hello." He ignored me, walking past us into the kitchen. The tension filled the air like static, invisible but heavy. I followed him, careful with my words. "Did the trip go okay?" He shrugged. "Fine, that was all." He didn't ask about me. Didn't notice the new paintings on the wall, or the way I'd moved the furniture to let in more light. But later, when he saw Benji lying at my feet as I read, he paused. "He's always near you," he said, not accusing, just observing. "Yes." He studied us for a moment, then smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Maybe you should have married him instead," I laughed, though it hurt. "Maybe I already did." He left the room after that. The door clicked shut. Benji lifted his head, watching me carefully. I forced a smile. "It's okay," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep. The air felt too thick, the silence too loud. From the next room came the faint sound of my husband shifting, sighing, the sound of distance made audible. Then, just like before, I heard the soft padding of paws. Benji pushed open the door and stepped inside. Eyes bright in the dark. I didn't say a word. I just lifted the blanket. He climbed up beside me, curled into the familiar space, and exhaled deeply, his breath warm against my arm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the world humming its quiet, endless rhythm, and in that small, fragile peace, I finally drifted into sleep. Days became weeks. The small routines that once felt temporary turned into habits. Morning walks, quiet dinners, evenings spent in the dim glow of candlelight, while the rest of the house slept. My husband and I moved around each other like planets in separate orbits, close enough to share gravity, but never colliding. Sometimes I caught him looking at me the way you look at something you once loved, but can't quite recognize anymore. Other times I'd feel his gaze linger on Benji, unreadable. Once, he said, "He follows you like he's afraid to lose you." And before I could stop myself, I replied, "Maybe he's the only one who isn't trying to." He didn't respond. He just walked away, his silence saying everything words couldn't. Spring came fully at last. The snow melted, revealing the green beneath, fragile and bright. The world smelled new again. I painted the fields as they woke, strokes of gold and green, splashes of light. Benji sat in the grass beside me, tail sweeping slowly back and forth. Children's laughter drifted from the road, neighbors walking their dogs, the sound of life outside this little world I'd built. I realized then how long it had been since I'd stepped beyond our fence. The thought scared me a little. But Benji turned to me, ears perked, eyes bright, as if sensing the hesitation. "Maybe it's time," I said quietly. He stood, tail wagging, and for the first time in months, I opened the gate. We walked for hours that day, down the dirt road, past the old willow tree, all the way to the edge of the lake. The air smelled of mud and pine, the sky wide and open. Benji ran ahead, bounding through puddles, barking at nothing. I laughed, a real laugh this time, unguarded, unmeasured. It startled me how unfamiliar it sounded. When I sat on the shore, he came to rest beside me, his head on my lap. I watched the water shimmer under the afternoon sun, and for the first time in years, I felt alive, not just existing, living. The kind of living that comes after breaking, when you've lost so much that the smallest joy feels like a miracle. We stayed there until dusk. The sky turned violet, the lake catching the last of the light. When we finally walked home, the air had cooled. I could see the faint glow of our house in the distance, one warm window in a field of shadow. My husband's car was in the drive. My stomach tightened. Inside, the smell of dinner filled the air. His attempt, I realized. He'd cooked. The table was set for 2. He looked up when I entered, eyes tired but softer than I remembered. "Hey," he said. "You were gone a while." I needed air. He nodded, glancing at Benji, who sat obediently near the door. "He looks happy." "He is," he smiled faintly. "You do too." The words hit me harder than I expected. "Maybe I am," I said quietly. For a moment we stood there in silence, the kind that wasn't cruel this time, just uncertain. A space waiting to be filled. Then he said, "Sit, eat." So I did. We didn't talk much, but the quiet felt different, lighter somehow, tentative but alive. At one point, I caught him looking at me with something like nostalgia. "Do you remember when we first moved here?" he asked. "You said this house felt too big." "I remember. You said we'd fill it with laughter." I smiled faintly. Guess we filled it with silence instead. He didn't argue. He just nodded, then reached down to scratch behind Benji's ear. The gesture was small, almost shy, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't pull away from the moment. Maybe things wouldn't go back to how they were. Maybe they shouldn't. But in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by fading light and the soft breath of a dog who had somehow become our truest link, I felt something flicker. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Hope. That night, I dreamed of light, the kind that breaks through clouds after rain. When I woke, Benji was lying at the foot of the bed again, tail twitching in sleep. Through the thin wall, I heard my husband stir. The sound faint but human, alive. For once, it didn't sound like distance. It sounded like possibility. The morning came soft and gold. I stood by the window, watching sunlight spill across the fields. Benji came to sit beside me, pressing against my leg. I placed my hand on his head and whispered, "You did it, didn't you? You saved us." He looked up at me, eyes shining, and in that look, I saw everything I couldn't say aloud. Forgiveness, patience, love that didn't ask for anything in return. Sometimes salvation comes quietly. Sometimes it walks on 4 legs. And sometimes it just enters your room one night and never leaves. Morning sunlight poured through the window in long golden stripes, cutting across the floor and spilling over the bed. The world outside was impossibly quiet, the kind of stillness that only happens after a long night of rain. You could feel it, that fragile calm that lives between endings and beginnings. Benji stirred at my feet, stretching with a soft groan before lifting his head. His fur caught the light like threads of copper. I smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Good morning," I whispered. He yawned in reply, the sound deep and slow, before hopping down and padding toward the door. His nails clicked softly against the wood, steady, patient. Through the wall came the faint creak of the floorboards. My husband was awake. For a moment I stayed still, listening, Not to the noise itself, but to the weight of it, the quiet rhythm of someone moving just beyond reach. It was strange, how a sound that used to mean comfort had come to mean so many other things. I sat up slowly. My reflection caught in the mirror, hair tangled, eyes softer than they'd been in months. There was something unfamiliar there, too. Something alive. I breathed it in. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like coffee. My husband stood by the counter, stirring sugar into his cup. He looked up when I entered, offering a hesitant smile, the kind that came with a question behind it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. Benji brushed against my leg, tail wagging. My husband crouched, letting him sniff his hand before giving his head a gentle pat. "He likes you again," I said quietly. "He always did," he answered. "I think I'm the one who forgot how to show it." His voice was calm, low, not the clipped tone of someone rushing out the door, but something closer to what I remembered. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the counter opposite him. The silence between us wasn't sharp this time. It was simply present, a space that didn't demand to be filled. For a long while, we just stood there, sharing the same air, the same morning. Then he said, "I was thinking we should take him out today." "The three of us," I looked up. "Together?" "Yeah, maybe that trail near the river." "You always liked it." Something flickered inside me. Surprise. Maybe or hope, though I barely recognized the feeling anymore. "Okay," I said. Benji's ears perked, as if he'd understood every word. The river trail hadn't changed much since the last time we'd gone. A winding path through tall pines and moss-covered rocks. The water glinting like liquid glass under the late spring sun. I'd forgotten how it smelled there. Wildflowers, wet earth, pine resin. Forgotten how it sounded, too. The soft murmur of water moving around stones, the distant call of birds echoing through the trees. My husband walked ahead, the leash loose in his hand while I trailed behind, watching Benji dart between us, tail wagging, nose buried in every new scent. "He's happier out here," I said. "He's free," my husband replied, glancing back at me. "So are you." The words caught me off guard. I didn't answer right away. The sunlight dappled his face as he turned back to the path. There were new lines around his eyes, faint but there. Time had been working on both of us in quiet ways. We stopped by the water after a while. Benji trotted straight into the shallows, tail swishing as he splashed. I laughed. The sound escaped before I could think to hold it back. My husband turned toward me, that small, real smile spreading across his face. "I missed that," he said. "What?" "You laughing." I looked down at the water, rippling gold in the light. "I didn't think I still remembered how." "You do." He took a step closer. "You always did." For a moment, the world shrank to the space between us, the hush of wind, the sound of the river, the quiet history pressing against the air. Then Benji barked, breaking the spell. He'd found a stick and dropped it at our feet, tail wagging furiously, waiting. My husband chuckled, picked it up, and threw it into the water. Benji bounded after it, clumsy and joyful, sending waves scattering. We both laughed then, a sound that felt like forgiveness, like breathing again after too long underwater. On the walk back, the air turned cooler. The light softened into that late afternoon gold that makes everything feel like memory. "I don't know when we stopped talking," my husband said quietly. "Maybe it was never about the talking," I replied. "Maybe it was about listening." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the path. "I didn't listen to you. I thought providing was enough, that being here went or at least near when he was the same thing as being present." "It's not," I said, but my voice wasn't sharp. It was tired, gentle. "I stopped reaching for you too." We both did. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know if we can fix it." "Maybe we don't have to fix it," I said. "Maybe we just have to start again." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of water and leaves. Benji walked ahead of us, tail wagging, leading the way home. That evening, the sky turned lavender and silver. The air hummed with the quiet of endings. My husband made dinner, pasta, simple but warm. We ate by the window, the kind of meal that didn't need conversation to feel whole. Afterward, he poured wine, and we sat in the living room while Benji curled up by the fire. "Do you remember when we first brought him home?" he asked. I smiled faintly. He was terrified of the stairs. "You carried him up. You told me not to, that he had to learn on his own." He chuckled. "He learned anyway." "Yeah," I said softly. "We all did." Later that night, I went to bed before him. I left the door open, a small invitation. Benji followed me, settling on the rug beside the bed. His usual spot, through the half-open doorway. I could see the faint glow of the living room lamp, the shadow of my husband's figure moving across the wall. When the light went out, I heard his footsteps pause outside the door. Then came the soft creak of hinges, the rustle of fabric. He didn't say anything. He just lay down on the other side of the bed, not too close, not too far. I could feel the warmth of him there, the faint rhythm of his breathing. For a long time, neither of us moved. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. Benji let out a deep sigh, content. And in the quiet, something inside me, something that had been sleeping for a long time, finally exhaled. The days that followed unfolded gently. We didn't rush anything. The old patterns didn't vanish overnight, but they softened around the edges. We talked more, about small things at first, the weather, groceries, plans for the garden. Then about real things, fear, loss, the way time steals people without taking their faces. Benji was always there, somewhere between us. Sometimes he'd rest his head on my husband's knee. Other times he'd sit beside me, as if balancing the gravity of two worlds that were slowly learning to share the same center again. Love wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, steady, like the sound of paws against the floor in the middle of the night. Summer came with a heat that made everything slow. The fields turned gold. The river dried to a trickle. We spent more evenings outside, sitting on the porch with lemonade and long silences that felt easy now. One evening, I was painting while Benji lay sprawled beside my chair. My husband watched from the steps, his elbows on his knees, smiling faintly. "He's getting older," he said. I glanced down. There was gray around Benji's muzzle now, just a dusting, barely noticeable. But he was right. The years had started to show. "We all are," I said. He nodded. "I don't want to waste any more of them." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man I'd fallen in love with. Buried, weathered, but still there. "You're not," I said. "Not anymore." He smiled then, and something in my chest loosened, like a knot finally coming undone. That night, I dreamed of water, of Benji running along the shore, sunlight flashing off his fur. My husband was there too, laughing, barefoot in the shallows. The air was warm, endless. When I woke, dawn was breaking. The room was quiet. Benji wasn't on the rug. My heart stuttered. I sat up, listening. Then I saw him by the open door, sitting in the hallway, watching the sunrise through the window. The light painted him gold. I went to him, knelt beside him, and rested my hand on his back. His fur was warm beneath my palm. He leaned into the touch, eyes half closed. Something about the stillness of that moment felt too perfect, too complete. I whispered, "Hey, what are you thinking about?" He turned his head slightly, looked at me, and let out a soft breath. Then he rested his head against my arm. We stayed like that for a long time, the world outside slowly waking. When my husband found us a few minutes later, he knelt too, hand on Benji's side. We both knew, without words, what was coming. The vet said it was age, gentle, inevitable. Nothing sudden, nothing cruel, just time doing what time always does. We gave him every comfort, soft blankets, sunlight, space. The house felt quieter, like it was waiting with us. The night before, I lay beside him on the floor, whispering stories until my voice broke. About the first storm, the first walk, the first night he'd come into my room and saved me without ever knowing it. My husband sat nearby, his hand resting on Benji's paw. No one spoke of endings. We just listened to his breathing, slow and steady, until the rhythm finally faded into stillness. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, filling the corners of the days that used to hold laughter. The first morning without him, I woke before sunrise out of habit. For a moment, I expected to hear the sound of paws outside the door, but there was only silence. I walked to the window. The fields shimmered with dew. A new day. Indifferent. Beautiful. My husband joined me, his arm slipping quietly around my shoulders. He had a good life, he said softly. No, I whispered. He gave us one. Weeks passed. The ache didn't fade, but it changed shape. It became something quieter, something woven into everything we did. We planted a tree for him at the edge of the yard, a willow near the old fence. The wind caught its leaves and made them whisper, like breath. Sometimes at night, when the wind moved just right, I swore I could hear the faint thud of paws on the porch, the soft exhale of a loyal soul still keeping watch. And somehow, that thought didn't hurt. It felt like love that had simply found a new form. One evening, months later, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The world glowed orange and gold, the sky stretching wide and forgiving. My husband joined me, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed me one and sat down beside me. You still think about him? He asked. Every day, I said. Me too. We fell into silence again, comfortable now, unbroken by guilt or fear. The willow tree swayed gently in the wind, its shadow long and soft across the grass. He's still here, I said quietly. I know, he replied. He always will be. That night I left the window open. The air was cool, the sound of crickets a steady hum. I lay there, eyes half closed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace, not the kind that hides from pain, but the kind that grows from it, the kind that stays. Through the open window came the scent of rain and the faintest echo of movement. So light it might have been memory, or maybe just the night breathing. I smiled, eyes stinging but soft, because I knew what it meant. He'd come back. Not to stay, but to remind me of what I'd learned. That love doesn't vanish when the body leaves. It lingers, in the air, in the spaces we once shared, in the people we learned to hold again. And in the quiet moments, when the house feels too still, if I listen closely enough, I can still hear it, the soft sound of paws against the floor, a reminder that even after everything, after loss, after silence, after time itself, some hearts just keep going.